Hello and welcome to what I have chosen to call a history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll. You may call it what you like. It's a day to talk about unjust judgment for a band and for a film, both at the same time, because both creators were, let's say, not having the best time professionally, even though their careers were, by and large, going great. And they were definitely making a lot of money. They had a ton of fans. They had a lot of forward momentum. And this era of their careers did little to actually stop that momentum, even though a lot of people hated what they were doing at this time. Yes, this is the AC/DC and Maximum Overdrive episode of a history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll. Thank you for being here, because if you're here right now, you're one of maybe two or three kinds of people. Someone that loves universally despised movies because you can see the charms in them that other people can't. You're a huge AC/DC fan and you care about their whole career and find that no one really talks about this era often enough because it's not very glorious and it's a bit troubled. Or you're just a regular listener of mine and you're listening to this episode because it's the next episode in the sequence in which you're listening to it. I love all of you so much for being here right now, no matter what your motivation. Because now we're together. I'm one of you, you're one of us. Here we go. My basic thoughts on this film is it's all about gags. And when I say gags, it's a term that you hear a lot when it comes to special effects guys in the horror business and genre, and you listen to too many film commentaries like I have with people like Greg Nicotero or Tom Savini. If you know, to think of it as like a script or a screenplay or a narrative is doing yourself a disservice. You're just going to be upset and you're just going to be disappointed. This is about high spots, to use a trashy pro wrestling term, which is what they say when someone's about to do a backflip off of a ladder onto a flaming table or something. Yeah, it's a high spot in a pro wrestling match. This is, about gags like gags are things that they engineer behind the scenes to make a head explode and seem believable or at least fun or funny. It's all about wounds. It's all about demolitions and explosions. It's all about the fun of celebrating horror that mostly happens in broad daylight, which, as we all know, is not the way most people want to do horror. It's pure mid-1980s, glorious, I would say low-budget horror, but it had a really good budget and it had a lot of support behind it because it was produced by Dino De Laurentiis. And De Laurentiis was like the opposite of Hollywood for the most part when it comes to his productions. He's Italian. So he's gonna film in Wilmington, North Carolina, and he's gonna tell his people, we're gonna make this happen with no union rules. we're gonna do a lot of stuff ourselves. A lot of stunts are gonna be, homegrown and trial by error. And it's just, that's kind of what they got. And we're gonna have first-time director Stephen King taking care of all of it because I just bought the rights to make 3 Stephen King films in a row to impress a woman that I'm in love with named Martha. And Stephen King is the most bankable author in the damn universe right now. So there's no way this is going to backfire on me. This is a film that's all about like kills and murder and dismemberment for its own sake. Like how a Steve Vai or a Joe Satriani album is just a ton of songs written to facilitate the guitar solos, which is the whole point of the actual song and the album and the whole career. Like, they don't care. It's like Frank Zappa's "Shut Up and Play Your Guitar" albums. Yeah, they were just edited guitar solos over and over, in sequence. That's kind of what this is. And to watch it and say, well, I didn't really find the characters very believable, is just to say, this movie's not for you, and you're too dumb to realize it. You know what a real bad movie is? A real bad movie is a $1 budget action adventure, science fiction, fantasy picture that's built off of the love of a previous generation's audience, caring about the characters from the 70s or the 80s, and bringing it all back and still making nobody happy, even though you had all those things going for you. No believable characters, no engaging plot, no character arcs, no understandable motivation for anybody. That's a bad movie. Maximum Overdrive is just glorious schlock. And if you don't like it, it's your fault for walking into the glorious schlock store and giving them $100,000 and walking away with something that you didn't want. You wanted $100,000 worth of like gold and fine chocolates and roses. That's not on the rest of us. That's on you. Some songs are just for dancing, right? That's why Bob Dylan doesn't have an extended series of like extended dance remixes produced by Flood, from the 80s. He knew his stuff was not for dancing to, for the most part. Stephen King didn't come along saying, I'm going to get like AC/DC to do the soundtrack for my movie, which is basically going to be, the greatest thing since Moby Dick. And it wasn't even as good as a George Romero film. Like George Romero is an amazing talent and a profoundly effective horror filmmaker. Even though like one of his best films is Dawn of the Dead, where the whole thing looks ridiculous because the zombies have like wintergreen looking face paint on them. And it was supposed to look different when it was filmed with certain lenses and certain lighting. And when they were done, they looked at it and went, oh, that didn't work. Oh, well, I guess we're putting it out that way. So all these zombies have like ridiculous clown makeup on. And it was still one of the most profoundly horrifying and effective movies at the time, especially with its, consumerist social commentary that came through. And that's why we love it. Like, we love it. Well, we love it for so many reasons. But like George Romero was seen as trash. And he's like 10 steps above what we're going to talk about today with Maximum Overdrive. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. Let's go into a little bit of the backstory with Stephen King and this project. So back in June of 73, that's 1973, that long ago, there was a gentleman's magazine. And before the internet had lots of free footage and pictures of naked people doing things that naked people do, you had to be a person who purchased magazines that depicted such things of private happenings with naked people. Cavalier magazine was one of them. And this is how Stephen King got started selling his stories in the 70s while he was still like teaching English at a high school, I believe, in Maine, and living in a trailer with his wife and basically trying to get off the ground now that he's graduated college and had a bunch of rejection letters from other like science fiction and fantasy magazines and things like that. He found that porn magazines were always looking for short fiction that was kind of shocking, and he was submitting a lot of stories to them. It took a little while and a few rejections again, but he started selling a lot of these. And once he got big from selling his novels like Carrie and The Shining and Cujo, and then all three of those got picture deals in Hollywood, he was putting out collections of these earlier works of short fiction in paperback, novel form, collections of them, and trying to get them optioned for films as well. So after he does, get big from Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Shining, all that stuff, he puts this story called Trucks that was featured in 73 in Cavalier magazine in a collection called Night Shift. Night Shift would also feature a lot of other recognizable stories like Graveyard Shift, which became a film, let's see, The Mangler became a film. Battleground became a sort of short story televised on TNT for the I think it was Nightmares and Dreamscapes, or I may be wrong, but Trucks was one. Sometimes They Come Back became a film. The Lawnmower Man became a film. Quitters Incorporated became 1/3 of a film in the anthology movie Cat's Eye that De Laurentiis would put out. Children of the Corn was a big one. That became like a 7-part straight-to-video series after the first movie that people actually liked. Things like that. And the conversation about what Stephen King stories make for good adaptations is one that has taken place in a million other podcasts and a million other YouTube channels. I would say that, in my opinion, his shorter stories, being more open to interpretation, stand a better chance of being good adaptations. And when they're not, you can pretty much blame the filmmakers for it, not him. Things like Stand By Me, that was a short story called The Body. Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption became one of a lot of people's favorite albums, books, and favorite films of all time. Misery was a novel that became one of his best adaptations, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no proven track record either way, because there's a lot of ways to screw up one of his bigger novels, and there's a lot of ways to screw up his short stories too. The main thing was, at this time in his career, he's feeling his oats. He's very successful. He's rich. He's a family man. He's got his wife and kids, staying in the area when they're making the film. He's just, come off the success tangentially of Dino De Laurentiis making the movie Firestarter with Drew Barrymore. And that was a big success. That was true to the novel enough for him and for fans to appreciate. And it's not a terribly complicated, multi-layered story as far as I can tell. It doesn't have like a million, heavy layered characters in it either. So a good formula for a adaptation that doesn't cost a lot of money, unless you were talking about some of the effects and the fire stunts and things like that. Now, because I'm also halfway through, or actually 2/3 or 4/85 or 9/12 of the way through making a Janis Joplin episode right now, I have to note something that I'm very likely going to note in that episode as well, that there is a very young man in the film The Rose, starring Bette Midler, who plays an airborne ranger that the Janis Joplin character, played by Bette Midler, known as The Rose, decides needs to be her new head of security, personal security. Follow her around everywhere because he's just so cute. And she takes him on her plane, on tour. And that young man would go on to play the part of the father in Firestarter. Quick note from future Jay, who's listening back to this now. I was going to mention he also was the father of Matt Murdock in the first Daredevil movie with Ben Affleck. He was battling Jack Murdock, the boxer. David Keith, Google him. The first person I want to talk about when it comes to the casting of this is Emilio Estevez. Growing up in America, I've only ever heard his, in Entertainment Tonight or interviews, I've only ever heard him referred to as Estevez. But I assume that's just a mispronunciation by Americans of a clearly Mexican or South American or Latin in origin name of Estevez. He's the brother of Charlie Sheen and the son of Martin Sheen. My understanding is that Emilio kept his family name as it was given to him, as it was on his birth certificate, Estevez, where Martin and Charlie wanted to go with maybe it was another family member's last name or something like that, and they thought that would be more acceptable for entertainment, and clearly it worked out for all three of them. Point is, Emilio gets in the film because Martin Sheen, his father, was in the film The Dead Zone with one Christopher Walken playing the main character. Martin Sheen was playing a presidential candidate that Martin Sheen's character tries to assassinate. I won't tell you how that story goes. I will just tell you that the film is fantastic for its era and for being a King adaptation, that I think all the Stephen Kinginess of it came across really, really well. If really old movies aren't your thing, it probably won't be your thing. It's very much something of its time. But it's simple, but it's engaging, and it just the Stephen King twist ending sort of, I mean, not twist, but the cool way it works out in the end is very satisfying. At this time, Emilio is breaking out as a star. He had just been in Repo Man, and we're going to talk a lot about that one in another episode about Southern California punk and hardcore in the mid-'80s. But for now, we're going to focus on him coming over to the East Coast and meeting up with his co-star, who had just come down from New York doing a Broadway run on Richard III with Al Pacino. And her name was Laura Harrington. And she would go on to also be in The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai. So we're going to have an episode about that with her. I saw her for the first time in What's Eating Gilbert Grape in 1993, playing the role of Amy. Oh, that's a sad movie. I don't know what it was about my teen years in the 90s, but I watched that a few times. She had done a lot of other, stuff, on TV, worked a lot. She was in stuff like, Perfect Witness, Equal Justice, Fairy Tale Theater. Oh, that's great. She might have worked with Bernadette Peters there. Quantum Leap, things like that. Oh, she was in The Devil's Advocate. Interesting. All right, I'm going to stop looking at her IMDb right now. I've done too much research about this. I don't need to be clicking on new stuff. She talks about the fact that, having come from New York and being so young and sort of struggling and living in a really small, tiny, expensive place up there, she was thrilled to be in Wilmington and have a condo on the beach and staying next to Emilio Estevez and, hanging out with him. He was super nice, apparently, and very caring and considerate. And then, Tom Cruise would show up, and they'd all go boogie boarding together because he was friends with Tom Cruise at the time. And he was going out with Demi Moore. So she'd be flying in and out on the weekends to hang out with them and do whatever, have a good time. So that's, got to be a really cool experience for someone at that, level of their career. But they're about to find out how miserable they can be on the set of a movie. This movie also has a young Yardley Smith who was telling a couple of people on the set that, yes, after this, she's going to record some voiceover stuff for a cartoon thing on the Tracy Ullman show that she had just gotten. And, of course, that would become The Simpsons. And Yardley Smith would be the voice of Lisa Simpson from 1989 until whenever you're probably listening to this. Now, when it comes to the impression of Stephen King on the set, being that he was the writer and the director, people would say things like, he's obviously got some genius factor to him to be able to write so many stories. Someone says he had met an actress and excused himself and then went to the bathroom. Comes back a few minutes later and sat down and said, I just thought of a story, and then pitched a story that was inspired by just meeting this actress on the set of the film. And then a day later, he had 18 pages of that story that he had just thought of when he went to the bathroom. He did things like, ask someone to give him a word. Someone on the set said, how do you write? And he said, pick a word. So he picked a word, and the word was fly. And Stephen King sat down at a typewriter and started typing. Half an hour later, he had 5,000 words on the word fly. Others would describe him as having the heart of a 9-year-old boy. He was always coming up with stuff to spook you and scare you with. He was always coming up with bizarre artifacts. They thought of him as a geeky kid who wanted to show you a frog, in a jar or something. He was very offbeat, very provocative, but kind and silly. He also had a lot of routines. In the morning, people said he would huddle up with his family, his kids and his wife, and they would have a little a football huddle kind of thing, and they would all, sort of go team kind of a moment, get excited about the day and go do what they were going to do. Also that he would like to eat sardines in the morning and had fish breath all day long because of that, but that was a routine of his and sort of might have been a superstition that he didn't want to break that routine or else he'd have bad luck. He also said he got good luck from this, having maybe a piece of his wife's underwear tucked into his belt. That was one of his totems too on the set. That made people kind of smile, but curious too. Now, he had some hopes about getting Bruce Springsteen to play the character that became Emilio Estevez's character. I still can't unprogram myself. I apologize. Estevez. And Dino De Laurentiis is like, first of all, he's trying to save money. And second of all, he doesn't know who Bruce Springsteen is. He doesn't know who the biggest rock star in the freaking world is right now. So he's not having it. And there you go. The big disappointment for Stephen King. And some people would say that when that became like an official decree that there's no Bruce Springsteen, Stephen King cared a lot less about what happened next, because that was one of the things that got him to, excited about making this film. And it's something about these mid-'80s films, with Bruce Springsteen. This is probably the least of the three that I can think of, but I know that he was a person they tried to get involved with the Light of Day film with Joan Jett and Michael J. Fox, unless I'm remembering something wrong. I know they wanted him for that, and he said no, but I think he worked on some of the songwriting for it. I think that was his song. Like Light of Day was his song, but he wouldn't be involved on camera. And then the other big one was the Eddie and the Cruisers film, which was adapted from a novel, and the author of the novel sort of, I think, created the vision of a Bruce Springsteen kind of a singer, from the Jersey boardwalk shore 70s bar band kind of vibe. So if you're upset, I haven't talked about AC/DC yet, I apologize, but the more of these episodes I do, the more I get a sense of the fundamental interconnectedness of all things when it comes to Hollywood and rock and roll at certain eras, and how they all are striving for a lot of the same things sometimes. Another note about Stephen King, he himself admits he was coked out of his mind on the set of this film. Other people on the crew have said, it was the 80s and everyone was on coke. But they didn't see him abusing it or being necessarily the kind of guy that was acting out because he was on cocaine. They did see him drink a lot of beers starting at like 6 o'clock or so. It was, like party time, and he would be on his 10th beer in like 2.5, 3 hours from that point on. Someone else that worked on the production that said, though, they didn't have any indication he was on drugs. But then in hindsight, after hearing this, they said, maybe it makes sense because every night we come to see the dailies and we were watching every take. And the dailies is just like the daily, like everything you've recorded. It's time to sort of look it over and make sure there's no problems. And Stephen King was very bored. He was getting bored because the dailies were 2 hours long. And now that you tell me this quote, I imagine that with cocaine inside, 2 hours sitting is very long. I'm going to make one more connection, in this case to John Carpenter, before I move on to talking about some AC/DC. I love the fact that we have the Stephen King recurring theme of mean-spirited boss or very petty, very controlling boss character. In this case, for the Dixie Boy truck stop, it's Pat Hingle portraying the boss, Bubba. And he was also Commissioner Gordon in a bunch of the Batman movies in the 90s. He was Horace the bartender in The Quick and the Dead, directed by Sam Raimi, who we're going to get into in a second. But most importantly, he played Colonel Tom Parker in the movie Elvis! Directed by John Carpenter. And if you watch the trailer to Maximum Overdrive on YouTube, you will hear background music that was taken or handed over by John Carpenter for Stephen King's use directly from Halloween 3. And you're like, Jay, John Carpenter didn't direct Halloween 3. I'm like, no, but he did do the score like he had done previous Halloween movies, and he got paid for that at least. He was also my favorite cranky judge in the movie Hang 'em High with Clint Eastwood. Such a good film. If you ever want to see Clint Eastwood being vanquished by someone, it's this cranky, sweaty judge played by Pat Hingle. And Pat Hingle's been in a million things, and you've seen him. If you've watched anything from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you've probably seen him in something. So to quickly round out all the extra connections, I want to finish up this part with mention again of Sam Raimi. Sam Raimi, some will know as the director of the first of the major Hollywood adaptations of the Spider-Man story from Marvel Comics. Of course, This film features a Green Goblin mask on a semi-truck. That's a Marvel Comics character that was in the Sam Raimi first Spider-Man film. Well, it turns out they couldn't get Evil Dead 2 financed by anybody at this time. This is according to Bruce Campbell on Eli Roth's History of Horror podcast. Stephen King was a huge fan of the first Evil Dead movie from 1981 and gave them a big quote that they could use on posters, saying it was the most ferociously original, horror movie of the year or something like that. Ferociously was probably not the adverb. It was some other adverb. Very shocking and frightening type of an adverb, and he intentionally said of the year as his, part of his charity was, I will give you the rest of the year to use this quote. I'm not going to say of all time. And Sam Raimi and Rob Tappert absolutely credit Stephen King with being able to get that movie in the door, to a lot of meetings and a lot of people and a lot of get distribution after taking it to a couple of festivals. I think was what they did and shopping it around. But fast forward a couple years, Sam Raimi has made 2 other, movies and they didn't do well. So it was time to kind of go back to the horror idea again and try to make Evil Dead 2. The word gets around to Stephen King that they can't get financing for it and they're dead in the water. So Stephen King, working with Dino De Laurentiis, says, hey, Sam Raimi is the guy you should work with after I'm done with this. You should really back him on his next project. It's going to be really big if you do it. And that's how the whole Evil Dead franchise became a thing. Years later, Sam Raimi, the director and writer of Evil Dead, would end up making a little appearance in The Stand in 1990. That's a Stephen King story. Okay, time to talk about my bias on this one. There's a whole lot of bias when it comes to AC/DC and me. I got the AC/DC live album that came out in 91 or 92 back in the day, and I got to borrow a whole guitar book of the best of AC/DC, and I think it was like 500,000 pages long. Learned to play rhythm guitar mostly by playing along to that live album with Malcolm Young's parts. So all my debt of gratitude goes to the late Malcolm Young for sure for teaching me a lot of great stuff. And it's deceptively simple stuff to play. A lot of really good musicians think it's easy. And it is, if you do it exactly right. If you don't do it exactly right, it sounds horrible. It's got to be simple. There's got to be space in between the instruments for AC/DC to do their thing properly. And, yeah, this nice little flub there. That's me sort of goofing off and getting guitar tones here for a comparison that I'm going to do coming up later. There's a lot of basic elements to AC/DC that make their songs effective in ways that other bands that play with like 4 or 5 chords maximum can't do. The Ramones did it by constantly filling all that space nonstop with tons of downstroke guitars and, a lot of fast work on the hi-hat, consistent. That's why punk rock works, because they don't take a breath. AC/DC got lumped in with a lot of punk stuff after they went to England for the first time in the late 70s and actually found a pretty good following there, more so than they could get in Australia, their homeland, which is a big part of this topic we're going to get into. Reading AC/DC Maximum Rock and Roll by Murray Engelhart and Arnaud Durieux. I apologize to the French for my mispronunciation. I'm sure of that. Durieux. This was recommended to me, as well as Bon, The Last Highway, for sort of the definitive modern story of AC/DC. I would say Bon, The Last Highway, so far from what I've read, looks very thorough if you are primarily interested in Bon Scott as a person and the people that knew him directly and their various thoughts on what his drink and drug and sex life were like and how that contributes to his death. I'll leave it at that because I haven't finished the book yet. But for the most part, it's not where you go for the stories of AC/DC as a band and their touring and their business deals and stuff. Maximum Rock and Roll, The Ultimate Story of the World's Greatest Rock and Roll Band, is a great, really informative book. I've got a few other resources here I'm going to pull from. Again, I'm going to dip back into Sound of the Beast by Ian Christie, who I've touched on in a previous episode. Excellent book about the history of heavy metal in general. I guess I wanted to bring up the source material in this one because when I was a younger man trying to find information about AC/DC, there wasn't much to go on. It was like the late 90s, and there was one very small paperback book that I had that made it pretty clear that AC/DC themselves were very adept at misinformation. They liked keeping rock journalists guessing. They liked conflicting or contradicting their own stories from time to time, or changing their history from time to time at their own whim. So you couldn't really write a definitive story about them if you were going to write a book in the 70s, 80s, or 90s. This appears to have done the job pretty darn well, and I'm not even saying I've read it cover to cover. I'm just bouncing around through it, trying to get various chunks of info about. What I want to focus on today the most is the least talked about era of AC/DC, which is the Maximum Overdrive era. But I'm not gonna deny you the fun stuff, though. I'm not gonna hold back on the history that came before that. So I guess I want to say a couple of things to whoever might be my audience right now. I have a couple of things to postulate about who you may or may not be. I think some of you are listening because of Maximum Overdrive, Stephen King, stories about bad movies and how they're made. There's obviously another couple of podcasts you could have heard before this, put out years ago. Like How Did This Get Made, I think is one of them. I think that's a fun series. I can't really get into for the most part, but I've checked in on a couple of episodes here and there. Especially the Howard the Duck one. Holy smoke, that's great. But you could be that kind of a person who doesn't care too much about AC/DC, but you're willing to listen. You could also be a total AC/DC fanatic, in which case I hope you'll enjoy this part where we talk about the era where they were sort of least successful and nobody discusses. You could also be a casual fan of AC/DC or just a lover of rock and roll history, and you don't want to be denied the full story. So what I want to do is touch on enough details of their history leading up to Maximum Overdrive and then what happened immediately after, so that if you know a lot about AC/DC, you might catch a couple of details you haven't heard before. If you don't care about AC/DC, I hope you'll find this just in general an interesting narrative of the history of a group of men that changed rock and roll forever by being all about rock and roll and nothing else, and how business decisions affect an artist's sort of trajectory, and how their creative process was different during this time. But when we get into the Maximum Overdrive era, I'll bust out the guitar and do a little tone comparison for the music lovers out there, because I do want to explain in more than one way what makes, I believe, this era of post, for those about to rock, pre-Razor's Edge albums not as popular or successful or accessible. Because when you see video retrospectives of AC/DC, it's always just like, they started out in Australia and they had Scottish parents, and they got really famous and they made Highway to Hell and everything was great, and then their singer died, and then they made Back in Black and things were even better with their new singer, and then things were really rough and there was a dark period where people weren't buying a lot of their records, but hey, they're back now with a great triumphant new comeback album. And that goes for Ballbreaker. That goes for Rock or Bust. That goes for Black Ice. That goes for the new record album that recently came out, Power Up. Yes, I had to go look at it and remind myself. But that goes back to my bias. I'm really a Bon Scott era guy for the most part. And then I absolutely do love a ton of songs from the Brian Johnson era as well. So I'm not going to skimp on either one necessarily. So here we go. Let's go back to the beginning and talk about the Easy Beats. The Easy Beats are a sort of slightly bubblegumish sounding rock and roll band from Australia. George Young, Harry Vonda, Dick Diamond, and Snowy Fleet, and Stevie Wright had some pretty good pop hits in England and in America and in Australia. I think they got into the top, I want to say top 10 or top 20 or top 30, somewhere in there in America with Friday on My Mind. I'm not going to go look it up because who cares where it charted. That was their only hit in America. They did really, really well for themselves. And at the time they were doing well for themselves, a couple of kids named Angus and Malcolm Young, the younger brothers of George Young of the Easy Beats, got a taste of what it must be like to be in a rock and roll band and what it's like to be a rock and roll star, because it was either in a music magazine at the time that they were really peaking or on a radio interview. The person in charge of the interview released George Young's parents' home address. And Malcolm and Angus Young, at the early age of, somewhere early pubescence, found their home surrounded by squealing, crying, screaming teenage girls that wanted a piece of their older brother. And they figured, let's look into this when we get old enough. So Malcolm and Angus start working on becoming guitar players. Angus was so obsessed with the guitar that as soon as he got home from school, he wouldn't even bother to take off his schoolboy uniform. He would go straight to the bedroom, pick up his guitar, and just start flailing around, as he would for decades after, all over stages around the world, uncontrollably playing rock and roll riffs and blues licks as best he could as he was learning. Malcolm himself, actually, by some accounts, was good enough to be playing along with records by bands like Yes and other progressive rock stuff, or sort of more high-minded, rock material of the 70s. They had a musical family. They had a musical household. They had a piano. Their parents would have parties all the time and have adults over and their kids, and they would sing songs and have a great time. So they grew up with this, strongly encouraged. And they had a sort of adoring older sister who was a bit of a amateur seamstress. She was the one that suggested that, maybe she could, as they got older, she could sort of customize Angus's old schoolboy uniform or help him create new ones for the band, because clearly he was the most eye-catching one, and she thought that would be a good gimmick. Fun fact I learned just today is that he wasn't the only one in costume the first time he wore that costume on stage. Everyone in the band at that time decided, let's try to get a little more visibility and a little more attention by all dressing up in something a little more ridiculous or outrageous for this one particular gig and see how it goes. After that show, everyone else dropped their gimmicks except for Angus, who was clearly the breakout star and the one with the most sensible, utilitarian, and memorable visual gimmick that actually related more to his character on stage. There was a little bit of regret with George Young after his band, the Easy Beats, were done doing their thing, in that the band had progressed to the point where they had left behind their 3-chord guitar catchy song roots and tried to sort of expand into other more high-minded pursuits. And he didn't want to let his younger brothers sort of go that direction. Malcolm Young had noticed that while he was studying the Beatles and the Stones, they had gone into their Satanic Majesty's Request and Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour eras, and then kind of come back to a grittier sound in, Exile on Main Street for the Stones and Let It Be with songs like Get Back, which Malcolm really liked. And it was basically Malcolm watching what his brother's band went through and then what his 2 other favorite bands went through. And maybe not favorite bands. I know that The Who was actually, louder and more violent, so he kind of liked them better or counted them as a bigger influence than the Stones and the Beatles, for sure. He realized that they wanted to take their Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis influence as children and marry it with their modern day love of what the Stones and Beatles had done and keep it rock and roll. Keep it gritty, keep it bluesy, keep it moving. don't get too high-minded or heavy-handed with any of your themes. And that was the way they kept it forever. If being apolitical and not shooting their mouth off about current day issues at any given time was good enough for Jerry Lee Lewis, it was good enough for them. And the same thing with the beat, the backbeat. They would never lose the rock and roll backbeat. They would never stray out into more complex territories. There's plenty of other bands they saw that could do that, and that was not their thing. Malcolm, even though he was a very accomplished guitarist and piano player, decided to downplay his approach to rhythm guitar, leave more space in between the chords and the notes, and leave more room for his hyperactive little brother to take all the attention away from the rest of their band, except for maybe the lead singer at times. Notable influences for them when they started thinking in terms of being in a band together, which, by the way, their folks said, good luck, you'll be broken up in 2 weeks, because they were always fighting. They were coming from a place where their big influences were the Yardbirds, the Who, the Kinks, Small Faces, Stones, Spencer Davis Group, but also an extra fascination with Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill, rest in peace, of ZZ Top. Their interplay, for such a small group, and their rhythmic devices were fascinating. And they are fascinating to anyone that pays attention. Another band that sounds deceptively simple until you try to pull it off on stage. You can lose the groove really fast with ZZ Top songs or AC/DC songs if you are too up in your own head and you want to impress people and express yourself over committing to the vibe and the backbeat and the driving rhythms of those songs, especially drummers. You want to see a song get ruined. Give a drummer who likes playing fills and on the tom-toms an AC/DC or ZZ Top song, and they will destroy all the magic of those bands. It's based on space and simplicity, and a lot of musicians can't be comfortable in that. They get really antsy and they wreck it by overplaying, even if they maintain the beat and the rhythm, the beats per minute properly, and don't rush too fast, which is the hardest thing for a lot of drummers and other rhythm players, bass and guitar, to do. Now back to their musical influences and their mindset about playing, hard and fast rock music. There's a quote from Bon Scott back in the Prairie Sun, an Illinois newspaper in 1978, where he said, rock music has been held back by things like Woodstock and the hippie headband type of thing. We think we're, the first breakaway in some time from these folky things and whatnot. It was all good, mind you, but it wasn't rock and roll. The Easy Beats were the last rock band that I really liked. We're taking over where they've left off. In 1979, being asked his opinion about Angus, Bon Scott said, Angus? I think he's kind of crazy. Since the first night I saw the band way back in Australia, I knew their manager, and I'd never seen the band before and never even heard of AC/DC. And the manager said, just stand here. The band comes on in 2 minutes. So I stood there, and this band comes on, and there's this little guy about that big with a school uniform and a bag on his back going crazy, and I laughed, and I must have laughed for half an hour, and I still laugh. I still think he's great. So the core of AC/DC, Angus and Malcolm and Bon, who was actually born Ronald Scott, came to Perth, Australia from Scotland, like a lot of families at the time, trying to get away from some bad times financially and industry-wise and get a new start in Australia. This former penal colony of the British Empire. There's a great Bill Hicks bit about that, if you're so inclined. About 1993 or so, please go check it out. I started to tell it myself and then stopped. I'm not going to do that bit disservice. Find the version that's on his album, not the live in Australia version. So Bon's last name was Scott, but his real given name was Ronald Belford Scott. He got the nickname Bon because when he got to Australia as a little kid, other kids on the playground would just, let's see, what did he say? Direct quote was, my new schoolmates threatened to kick the shit out of me when they heard my Scottish accent. I had 1 week to learn to speak like them if I wanted to remain intact. Of course, I didn't take any notice. No one railroads me, and it made me all the more determined to speak my own way. That's how I got my name, the Bonnie Scott. See? Of course, as an adult, if you hear him in interviews, he does talk like an Australian. He talks like this. He has got a really, really voice, and he talks this way. Definitely not with a Scottish accent. So even though those kids didn't beat it out of him, evidently life did eventually. Considering how far Scott Ian went with his Queen's accent between the 80s and the 90s, and then how neutral it became in the 2000s, I think it's fair to give a little kid the rest of his life to figure out what his voice is going to sound like, the way he wants it to be. And sorry for the obscure Anthrax reference if nobody cares. So the boys start gigging at a place regularly called the Checkered Club. And they played long sets. They played, anywhere from 3 to 5 sets of 45 minutes a night. And so they had to stretch. So they had to, go back and forth with their guitar solos between Malcolm and Angus before the time when they really tightened everything up and started changing their roles a little bit. Angus once said in 1979 at Record Review, well, I take it back. This is inside the Bonfire box set that came out in the 90s, the booklet that I've had for a billion years. And it's so funny. It says Angus Young, Oakland, 1979. Record Review, USA, June, 1981. So I don't know. But the quote is, "Are you aware of people like Clapton and Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page? Yeah, they've been ripping me off for years. At the time I was playing, these were all the people who were famous. I'd see my brother Malcolm playing solos, and he played just as good as those guys, so why wasn't he famous?" Now I want to talk about what's going on in the year of 1974 for them. During this time, they're starting to gig. Harry and George, Harry Vonda and George Young, respectively, formerly of the Easy Beats and friends of theirs, obviously family of theirs, are now producers in the local scene, and they've got studio dates. They're recording other bands. They're getting good work, and they want to foster the career of these two boys and their band, AC/DC, which the name was taken from the back of their sister's sewing machine. Just alternating current, direct current is what AC/DC stands for. That was it from the very beginning. It had nothing to do with later implications of Antichrist, Devil Child, or AC/DC being sort of a bisexual or gay label for a lot of folks at the time. They did play gay bars at first. They didn't turn them down. They didn't feel comfortable with the average, let's say, cab driver accusing them of being gay. But they didn't mind getting paid to play for an audience, even if it was all homosexual gentlemen that they didn't really have interest in scoring with. But I'm going to read straight from the book AC/DC Maximum Rock and Roll by Murray Engelhart and Arnaud Derieux. It was February, this is 74, and March that Geordie, spelled Geordie, a tough glam band from Britain with a singer named Brian Johnson, toured Australia. Chris Gilby at Alberts helped organize the tour, as Alberts were representing the publishing interests of a UK company called Red Bus Music, who had signed Geordie. Angus saw them at Hornsby Police Boys Club and Malcolm at Checkers. I just love the idea that in 74, their future singer comes through their town, and they both see this band multiple times at two different weird little non-music venues. Well, one's a music venue, Checkers, but the Hornsby Police Boys Club. Ever eager to document his brother's progress, George again made arrangements to capture AC/DC on tape at his home in Epping, where he had a studio set up. Unfortunately, Smith's bass amp blew up, and the sessions didn't really fire. The sole result was just another take of Can I Sit Next to You, Girl, which is a song that they'd recorded previously. They demoed it already. They were trying to get a better run of it, I guess. While they had been gigging regularly, April brought a new chapter at an open-air gig at Victoria Park on the outskirts of the Central Business District of Sydney. AC/DC were determined to make an impact. A lasting impression at such a big show would be invaluable publicity. It was at this gig, here's the part I was mentioning earlier, that the costumes which had been under discussion were finally unveiled. Singer Dave Evans says, "We decided to dress pretty bizarre to get some attention. For Angus, his sister came up with the idea of him wearing a schoolboy uniform with short pants and a satchel on his back. The bass player, he decided to wear jodhpurs and a crash helmet and dark glasses, sort of like a highway copper. The drummer wore a kind of clown outfit with a top hat, sort of Harley Quinn, and Malcolm had a white jumpsuit and blue boots like an airman. I had red boots and fucking tight pants and a red and white striped jacket that was very colorful. People went, whoa, what's this? Especially the schoolboy uniform. The whole look of the band was just completely from outer space. It was just something different. We did the gig, and it went over great, of course. His big sister, Margaret, saw the possibilities of a stage costume, which would time freeze Angus as a 16-year-old. He was shy and so less than enthusiastic about the school uniform at first. And again, it took Malcolm and George to talk him around. For all its eye-catching impact, the schoolboy outfit was not the only character that Angus had in circulation over the coming months. In Zorro mode, for example, Angus would play the guitar with a bowing action with his plastic sword in a quiet nod to Jimmy Page's experimentation with a violin bow when he and Malcolm saw the Yardbirds in the late 60s. And the singer at the time, Dave Evans, talks about how he used to have fights on stage with me. Like he'd sword fight me. I had the mic stand, He'd just sort of sword fight me, and then I'd put him up on my shoulders. He used to play up on my shoulders. Angus would for the rest of his career, pretty much. I mean, not that it's over, but I believe until present day, play guitar while being carried around by his lead singer, whether it was Bon or whether it was Brian, at some point in almost every concert. So obviously, Mr. Evans was not long for the band. Other two members of the band were ousted pretty soon after that big show because they just weren't dedicated enough to the music as far as Malcolm and Angus were concerned and as far as George was concerned. So we mentioned Bon earlier already, having seen AC/DC, but he had also been helping them out as a driver when they were playing in Adelaide, but got picked up to be their lead singer, even though he was about 8-10 years older than them. They thought he was fantastic. He debuted, well, I don't know if it's a debut gig, but one of the earliest gigs in what I'm reading is Rockdale Masonic Hall in southern Sydney. Bon was wearing a red satin jumpsuit, bib, and brace overalls, and a shark's tooth around his neck. Spent most of the night making up the words as he went along, but there were no complaints. When it came to wordplay, Bon, as the world would see in the coming years, was in a class of his own. We'd run through half a dozen songs with Bon, says Malcolm, but just before he got on stage, he decided, what he's saying is before the first show they ever played, they didn't have a proper rehearsal. They ran through 6 songs, basically, in a very sort of casual fashion. Just before he got on stage, he decided to get half a bottle of whiskey down him and God knows what else. By the time he got on stage, he was beaming. He was ready, though. We had this singer before Bon, and he had his own little fan club of teeny boppy chicks that used to follow him everywhere. He laughs. On comes Bon, even before the band. He strides on and grabs the mic and announces, anyone that's come to see Dave Evans sing with AC/DC ain't going to see it tonight because the band have fired him because he got married. And he pointed right at these little chicks. We went, fucking hell, what's this guy done? We just got on and rocked, and Bon took command. He knew exactly what was going on. So when the time comes to get in the studio and make a proper record debut album, they did do a single of Baby Please Don't Go, a blues cover that they were pretty well known for. And if you want to look that up, their first appearance on television was a Baby Please Don't Go with Bon Scott dressed in drag, lipstick, rouge in his cheeks, and a blonde wig and pigtails with like the kind that probably has like a wire in the pigtails to like make them stick up like Pippi Longstocking, and I think it was a dress or a little blue skirt or something like that. And he's singing the lyrics, and then when the guitar solo takes off, he pulls out a lighter and a cigarette and just starts smoking on stage and grinning with his he's got like 5 teeth in his head at this point. He looks like a pirate dressed up like a little girly doll. It's amazing to watch. And I think the jury is sort of split on what that was meant to be as a statement, because part of their attitude was, look, there's a lot of cheeky boys dressed up in glitter outfits that are playing girlier to get girls, and there's, but they're not really that way, really. They're just doing the thing that's in at the time. So part of it is perceived as maybe taking the piss out of some of those guys that are acting a little girly when they're not really, and they're acting androgynous when they don't really mean it. And part of it can be Bond just saying, "I'm so tough, I don't care. I'll wear women's clothes. I'll be tougher than all the toughest tough guys in these boogie woogie bar bands, and I'll slay it. I'll slay it dressed like a little girl. I don't care. I'm more badass than all of you are. Either way, it's fun. It's a great bit of amazing performance and physical comedy to watch. He just doesn't give a shit when anyone thinks about him. It's fantastic. Plus, with Angus Young running around doing his thing with you, you're bulletproof. So back to my point about going in to make TNT, the first album that was recorded in July 1975 at Albert Studios in Sydney with George Young and Harry Vonda handling the producer's duties. They would actually kind of workshop the songs that Malcolm and Angus had been coming up with around the piano. They'd all sit together on the piano bench, and George would be on patrol. Bullshit detecting is the word, I guess, that's used to make sure nothing was too repetitive or not good enough, or just workshop things and sort of maximize their potential. I say this because it goes back to the perception of AC/DC as a dumb person's band that plays dumb music with no thought to it. There is a lot of thought that goes into playing effective rock and roll music that is that impactful, that makes you want to jump out of your seat and punch something or dance or, make love, albeit quite violently. It doesn't just happen when you play 3 chords on a guitar and a basic rock and roll drum beat. It takes work. More complex, progressive, jazzy musicians takes work to do what they do, absolutely. But most of their work is done individually, and the basics of what makes them great is done on a level of expertise that when they all get together, I've seen it sort of flow pretty freely and not take a lot of hammering and chiseling to make an arrangement work out. It's just sort of an understanding of, you're going to go there, then I'm going to go here, then we're going to have a drum break. Everyone do your thing. Everyone be amazing, and we'll all sort of express ourselves and play lots of notes. And that's very moving in its own way, and it's incredibly valid, and it helps other people strive to be great at what they do and try to emulate it. But if you're going to play simple rock and roll, there's a reason why the AC/DCs and the Jerry Lee Lewis's and the Little Richards and the Chuck Berrys are as impactful as they are. It's not a fluke. It takes thought, and it takes time. And during these times, they're playing with lots of other bar bands that can't understand why or how AC/DC is so effective and energetic and totally committed when a lot of these other rock musicians are just sort of going along with it and having an easy time and drinking lots of beers and hanging out and having a whole lifestyle of it. AC/DC is like wiped out after a show. They're not hanging around and partying with all the other bands. They're not being chatty. They've got nothing left in the tank after they're done playing. So after TNT is done recording, but not completely finished yet, has to go through mixing and mastering, things like that, I assume, because it hasn't been, and packaging and printing and pressing. But August of that same year, 1974, they get booked for like a week of school holiday lunchtime concerts at Meyer Department Store in the heart of Sydney, Australia. Oh, no, excuse me, Melbourne, Australia. I'll read from the narrative again. On paper, the free gig seemed like a great marketing idea, but there was anarchy when, for show number 1, in the girls' clothing section, thousands of fans arrived. Some fainted as the crowd surged towards the band, and equipment was toppled when those in the screaming mass with nowhere else to go split onto the small stage. After just a few minutes and only 2 songs, the show was shut down for the safety of everyone. The band were forced to make their escape into a changing room, but Bond was separated from the rest and had his shoes and most of his clothes, including part of his jeans, torn off by a swarm of girls. Malcolm came out of it all with a cut above his eye, but the store was really on the receiving end with thousands of dollars worth of merchandise stolen as well as general damage. So much for a 4-day engagement. Next came a big outdoor show in Sydney's Victoria Park on the 7th of September. And someone connected with the band named Chris Gilby figures that a bunch of radio ads on 2SM radio in Sydney would be a great way to promote this show. So on Saturday morning, he just sets off to Manly on Sydney's northern beaches with a 2SM tape recorder with the station's logo on the mic, which he figured would attract young people to want to talk on the radio station and tell them about why they love AC/DC. He starts asking strange people about AC/DC, and none of them have heard of this band on this particular day. No, what do they do? Are the responses. Who the hell is AC/DC? So he starts to just ask people about the bands they do like, and then he edits those answers into his questions about AC/DC. So he's like, who's your favorite band? And this is a quote. Oh, I like Sherbet. Why do you like Sherbet? Well, I like the singer Daryl Braithwaite's legs, some girl said. So I thought, that's cool. We'll use that for Angus. We'll put in a question saying, why do you like Angus? I like his legs. So he gets all these quotes from young boys and girls, and then fakes a whole 30-second spot where people are just raving about what appears to be this band AC/DC. Then he gets his friend's girlfriend to act like a concerned parent and like a concerned mother, and he says, imagine you're the mother of a kid who wants to go out to an AC/DC concert and you don't think that's such a good idea. What would you say? So it's just outside her front door, as if they were just interviewing housewives that day and, knocking on the door, recording it. And she goes, I wouldn't let my daughter go and see a band like them. They're disgusting, blah, blah, blah. So she goes on this big rant about what a horrible, depraved rock and roll band AC/DC was. And that helped promote this big show for them and get them more notoriety. Because what they're trying to build up to is international touring, but they feel like if they can't conquer Sydney, Melbourne, places like that, then there's really no point in going to other countries. That attitude would be flipped eventually, for sure. There's a big stretch during the Maximum Overdrive era and previous where they just don't go back to play Australia for a long, long time because of all the trouble they get in for being obnoxious, degenerate rock and rollers with a bad reputation everywhere they go. So let's talk about some of their early attention-getting tactics and shows when it comes to playing places like Melbourne, when it comes to some of their appearances on the television. We're talking about a time around the high voltage era. They got to be on a show called Countdown a lot, and they got to experiment with sort of their visual presentation quite a bit. During this era, there would be times when Angus would appear dressed up like in a gorilla costume, and he'd been in a cage that was like, hidden off stage at the beginning of the show, and then, would be sort of a surprise for the audience. He'd been, waiting for his time to start, for a long time, and the crowd goes crazy, and Bon is showing up more than one time dressed as a schoolgirl. I believe that on TV, and also at a big festival they were doing. Called Melbourne. It was called the Australian Concert for Bangladesh, organized by Freedom from Hunger with Daddy Cool at the top of the 11-band bill and AC/DC in 6th place after a band called Hush. They would get rained on that whole time, which messed up Bon's makeup quite a bit, his girly makeup, but didn't care. They, around this time, showed up on a television program called Polaroid in Concert, which was their sort of defining live television performance of that era, unlike Countdown shows, which were sort of played to a track. You got to kind of mime along with what you're doing for the most part. Sometimes I assume some of those might have had live vocals or something, but the band in general had to be playing along to a pre-recorded track from the album. And then this is coinciding with the weird time where, they're playing a lot of quote unquote heavy metal nights at a place called the Hard Rock Cafe. I don't know if that's the same sort of, franchised Hard Rock Cafe that we know around the world now, or just another place called the Hard Rock Cafe. I think it was probably an independent one. That's my guess. But then at that same time, there is a magazine called Ram that wants to let everyone know that, Australia has punk rock bands too, And Rolling Stone Australia referred to them as Melbourne's biggest punk band, which is all pretty wild. They just wanted to stay true to Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis and Muddy Waters and all their, rock and roll and blues and R&B influences. And that was where their sort of tough attitude came from. But they were loud and they were fast and they were aggressive. So journalists, I guess, had to tag them with something that seemed more like what they were seeing in other scenes around the country and around other countries at the time. But this is all happening well before the Sex Pistols played their first show. This happened before The Clash kind of appeared more publicly in August of '76. Wild, huh? I mean, punk was obviously a thing in America. New York at that time had been for a little while to the people that knew about it. But throughout their entire career, AC/DC would never, ever jump on those bandwagons. They would never, ever identify themselves as punk or heavy metal. I remember an interview with Angus where he was like, well, heavy metal is like guys with tight pants that do like gymnastics and big splits in midair and stuff like that. We don't do that. And punk, he's just like, well, they just say that because we played like 3-chord rock really loud and really fast. But as they're getting momentum and they're playing more large festivals and getting a lot of attention for their sort of wild antics visually and physically on stage, Angus becomes more fearless. He becomes more the type of guy to just launch himself into the audience and clear a path for himself and spin around in circles playing guitar solos. That is, because it's before wireless guitar transmitters, then his poor roadies have to untangle these knots that his guitar cables are left in by the end of the show. But this is also, an era where Bon Scott is ready to go for it himself. He's dressing up like Tarzan. He's rigged up a rope and I don't know if it's like in the lighting rig or whatever, and swinging out from the PA stacks of speakers. And at this Melbourne festival where they're playing with headliners Skyhooks, whom I've never heard of, and I'm sure most of us haven't, but I'm sure they whooped some ass back in their day. And bands called Split Ends, E-N-Z. And Angus says, these days you've got harnesses and everything. I'm gonna butcher this accent. I don't care. Every now and then I want to try to drop in Angus's accent. If I offend you, I apologize. These days you've got harnesses and everything, but Bon just got a rope flung up there and swung across the PA system. He cleared it. Then when we were doing the gig, he swung, but it was a bit like that cat in Bugs Bunny, Sylvester, swinging in all these dogs. He forgot that the kids were going to stand on their chairs, and he went straight into the crowd. There was a lot of young girls. He crawled like, okay, I can't do this. That was disgraceful. I apologize to all the Australian listeners, if I have any Australian listeners. I think as of the last count, there's 12 people that have ever downloaded this podcast in Australia as of this week. Let me start over. These days you've got harnesses and everything, but he, Bon, just got a rope flung up there and swung across the PA system. He cleared it. So he's talking about in practice, in rehearsal, sound check, right? So what he's about to say is Bon didn't do the math that there would be people standing on their chairs reaching up as high as they could for him. So instead of going over the tops of the crowd, he swung directly into their bodies. And there was a lot of young girls, and he crawled back on stage with just his jockstrap on. They tore all his clothes off. One of their crew members named Phil Eastick said the Melbourne show was one of the first times I'd seen them do that on the shoulders routine, Angus on top of Bon's shoulders, through the audience. And they do this from the front of the stage all the way to the back of this huge hall with the guitar plugged in the entire time to a cable that's that long. Bond just running around there in his loincloth, I guess. And then they did a bunch of daytime concerts for School Kids Week in May at the Hard Rock Cafe. Bond missed one show, and Angus and Malcolm had to fill in on vocals that time. This is also a time when, obviously, Bon Scott's getting more attention as a lead singer in his offstage life, while Angus is content to go home after shows, not really go out a lot unless he's really playing, and kick it with some comic books and some, tea and watching Clint Eastwood movies and such, whatever's on TV, practice his guitar. Bon is ending up naked at various places in public or private with multiple partners. And in one case, there was a late night liaison with a woman who he took multiple photographs of in the nude. And, that was their business until the next morning when she goes home after being all partied out and gets, I guess, picked up by the police while she's on her way to work for whatever reason. They take her home, find the photos, and I assume these are like self-developing photos or Polaroids or something like that because it happened so fast, and ask where she's been and who she's with. And then Bond gets busted for pornography. And then there's one day after that, I guess, I don't know. The book doesn't have the story about how he gets out of that pornography charge necessarily. I assume he gets thrown in jail and has to pay a fine of some kind. The father of this woman eventually tracks him down and bangs on his door while he's supposedly with somebody else because he shouted, "Fuck off, I'm having a fuck." And the dad didn't like that too much. Busted the door in with a friend of his, dragged Bon Scott out into the street and beat him up and tossed him into a rose bush. And that is how he lost his front teeth. His reputation was one of a person who would generally try to pacify things or talk things down when it came to conflict, especially with angry boyfriends or fathers or whatever, but he wouldn't back down from a fight when he knew there was really no other way to go with it. And having been in no fights myself that weren't conducted on a mat with pads and somebody who would agree to stop punching me in the face when I fell down, all I can say is, from what I've heard, the wisdom of violent people is, or people that are caught up in violence is, that if somebody physically starts assaulting you, especially in public, especially if they're drunk, you have two choices. One is to run away and preserve yourself, and the other is to launch into the fight. Because if you start getting shoved and knocked around and do the whole put your hands up and go, "Hey man, I don't want any trouble," it's going to get a lot worse for you, and you should have used that time to just run. Anyway, public service announcement for anyone here that needs it. So physical confrontations are going to get more frequent as they move further away from large cities and into more rural areas. It's a bit of a double-edged sword for the band because the crowds are more excited to see them because they've only been aware of them on television or maybe starting to hear them on the radio a little bit. So they're going to come out and check out what's happening. You got to, forgive me if you're of a certain age where you already know what I'm about to say and you've heard it a million times. But if you're younger and you don't live in places like this that are removed from major metropolitan areas, the mid-'70s is a time when, you might have seen a magazine article about a rock star or a band that's doing really well. You might have seen an interview on the television. In their case, you've seen them perform to a tape on television, very likely. But, if they're coming to your town, that's what your town is doing that day, right? This is going to shake things up and be a destination for excitement, adventure, all sorts of potential to meet, people that you want to get naked with that you wouldn't have a chance to meet otherwise at school or in the local grocery store. Act out and get wild. People just went out to see rock bands because that was something to do. So it wasn't just diehard rock fans that are going. There's just general human beings that don't know how to act at rock shows either. Okay. Imagine everyone at your high school being essentially the same entertainment demographic for one day. no matter what sort of nice music they supposedly liked or disco dance music they would normally stick to. They still want to go out and see this spectacle. They're still curious enough to want to go and see what kind of violence is going to happen or what kind of crazy rock and roll, sweaty, sexy madness is going to take place in their little town, right? But unfortunately, this also brings a lot of people that are already pissed off at AC/DC, having never seen them play before, because they're seen as a threat to all the men in town. You know, they're seen as just a bunch of pirates that are coming to take your women away for maybe the weekend, maybe the month, maybe the rest of the year. And so dudes just show up ready to fight the band on principle to prove that they rule this town. Angus talks about, we dodge a bottle here, dodge a fist there. The only time they'd stop trying to pick a fight with us is when it was hard and fast. Songs could start off slow, but they'd have to speed up in the middle. At one point at a show in Perth, Australia, somebody got on stage and then threw a wrestling hold on Angus, and Angus fought back. And then the local people decided to join in as well to fight for the honor of that random dude, apparently, who had, just assaulted a person playing a guitar solo. And then the police show up with full riot gear and break the whole thing up. Malcolm talks about a place in, he said Bendigo in Victoria. He said, all the youth of the town ready to beat the shit out of us. It was because somebody had one of their girlfriends last time they were in town. Somebody in the band presumably had one of their girlfriends. They'd like a bit of car chase, and Phil is a maniac behind the wheel. So Phil Rudd, the drummer, is their escape driver. So if any of that shit went on, Phil was doing his driving and all sorts of tricks. We used to go out in the bush roads. Bush roads for Americans would be country roads, would be out in the boondocks. Driving, who would pull around corners, quickly pull over, all lights out, hide. And we'd watch the guys go screaming past, crank up, and then go back into town, and then get their women. As Malcolm would go on to say, we were all little guys. I mean, let's face it, anybody could knock us over. But the smaller you are, the fucking bigger you think you've got to be. Bond was taller than us guys, but he wasn't too solid as a guy either. He'd drink a lot, and he'd always be staggering a wee bit here and there. But we were all brawlers. If we were all jumped on, we all got involved. No one running away. And that was the thing. We all stuck together, I guess. Extra fun note off on another topic is that in 1976, Frank Zappa would make his way to Australia and see AC/DC play in January of that year. He loved what he saw. Crazy band of little people with a rock and roll guitarist in a schoolboy outfit playing all kinds of notes. Malcolm, Angus, and Bon Scott loved Zappa. They loved his humor and thought he was an amazing musician. And he said he wanted to take them to America. That was the first. Angus says Zappa was the first guy that saw them in Australia and said, "I've got to get you over in the States." For whatever reason, it didn't pan out. And so because they didn't get to make that trip, they got back to work on what would eventually be the Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap album. At that point, let's see. I just realized, I haven't once consulted the Rolling Stone history of rock and roll, Rock of Ages, published in the mid 80s about AC/DC yet. I've been looking through so many other books. 75 is when their first album comes out, 75-ish, 76, depending on what country you're in, of course. And then by 85, 86, when this book came out, they have to have had, 8-10 years worth of notice, stories about AC/DC, or just something, or maybe a passing, they had one of the biggest albums of all time in Back in Black in the early, 1980, 81? I have too many numbers in my head. I can't remember off the top of my head, but, and then For Those About to Rock was even bigger than that one. So let me look into this Rock of Ages, Rolling Stone History of Rock and Roll by Ed Ward, Jeffrey Stokes, and Ken Tucker. And let me just see in the index here. I got Perry Como. Yeah, of course, no. Let's see, Broadside, Billy Brent, Jackie Brenston, that justifiably so. Yeah, of course. Let's see. Going backwards to the Archies, Pink Anderson, Ampar Records, Herb Albert mentioned. Hang on. ABC Network, Johnny Ace, Ace Records, Ackland, Acuff, Ray Acuff is mentioned. Okay. All right. Well, Bryan Adams. All right. I mean, maybe they didn't do a lot of stuff in this book about the kind of artists that were around in the 70s maybe they cut it off before that point. I mean, as I look through the index, what else? What do we've got? Oh, we got, Journey. 1, 2, 3, 4 mentions of Journey. Journey was pretty parallel, I think, timeline-wise with AC/DC. Wouldn't you say? I don't know, mid-70s to mid-80s, tons of hit records during that time, filling up arenas and stadiums and playing around the world like AC/DC was. Yeah, I guess they really wanted you to sort of focus more on that. Oh, look, James Taylor. Wow. James Taylor, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 mentions of James Taylor in this rock and roll history by Rolling Stone, and not a single mention of AC/DC. You dorks. You uptight dorks. Ugh. Back in Black and Highway to Hell are still two of the most popular albums ever recorded, alongside Michael Jackson's Thriller and the Eagles' Greatest Hits. And the Eagles had to do that with the Greatest Hits collection. Come on. And to all of you that say, music's not a competition, man, it's not about push. Shut up. These people have to be held accountable for their crimes against culture. These bastards at Rolling Stone. This is, I'm not trying to have a personal axe to grind. I keep that usually for the other episodes where I personally grind that axe against Rolling Stone. And I will absolutely cite them as a source whenever I find some really interesting stuff. And there's plenty of interesting stuff written in Rolling Stone. I'm not trashing the whole history of that magazine. But I'm trying to just sort of put this in perspective for you as we lead into the Maximum Overdrive era of AC/DC that I'm getting to soon, or getting to in the next episode, rather. That's how little respect they had, even though they're playing, some of the greatest rock anthems ever written, and they're changing the lives of guitar players, let alone the lives of women they had sex with, or, lead singers they inspired. They're just not seen as important at all to the mainstream music press. That is why it's important to bring up the fact that someone as brilliant as Frank Zappa and as crazy and as out there and totally sober as Frank Zappa recognized their greatness all the way back in 76 when they only still had one album out. So let's talk about the filming of It's a Long Way to the Top if you want to rock and roll, and also a bit about the bagpipes. Turns out Bon Scott just self-taught himself how to play the bagpipes because he was that talented. He hadn't really necessarily been a virtuoso when he was young. There's a photo of him holding the bagpipes in his full uniform in the Bonfire box set that is adorable. But they got a lot of musical help from George and Harry that played piano, and the band would sort of go through all their demos and their guitar ideas with George and Harry, Vanda and Young, when it came time to make the records happen. And they would all sort of workshop the songs, and they would sort of defer to the older brother contingent, as it were, and hammer out these ideas. And then they had the luxury of coming up with extra thoughts and plans for other instruments, like having the bagpipes, and It's a Long Way to the Top if you want to rock and roll. This song is a bit of a pain in the butt for guitar players that love AC/DC. You're so used to E, A, D, and G, and it starts on a B, but it's not quite in tune on the recording with your guitar if you tune up your guitar to be just right and in the pitch of a B chord. There's something about the wackiness of those bagpipes that I'm sure they couldn't play A440 with it for whatever reason. I mean, it's an instrument that's, I think, made out of a cow's bladder or a goat's bladder originally or something like that. It's not necessary. And then some reeds in the mouthpiece and holes in the little pipery part. Not always necessarily, a great blend when it comes to electric instruments and folk instruments, especially wind-powered ones. But it ended up being really, really catchy, but also the bane of Bond's existence from that point on out, because it was so popular that he had to truck that thing around wherever he went, and he had a hard time getting it gassed up right. You had to work so hard to pump it up full of air and get it to come in right when the guitars would, need you to come in. And the timing was quite often not there. The effect didn't work. He freaking hated being stuck with this gimmick of the bagpipes after he had been the one to play it on the album and in the video. Now, of course, back then, there was no MTV. There were no music videos per se, but there were filmed performances of lots of bands that, we would see years later. And when you go to YouTube now and look for It's a Long Way to the Top, if you want to rock and roll, you see this film footage of AC/DC playing on the back of a flatbed truck in a parade. And let's see, I got a couple of notes courtesy of, Maximum Rock and Roll, the book that I'm leaning on very heavily for this story. It was the 23rd. Oh, excuse me. It must have been still 76 where they were working on what was going to be Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. They had staggered those sessions so they could go out and play on the Lock Up Your Daughter's summer vacation tour of the country until the 23rd of January. There's a little joke from Malcolm Young on the VH1 Behind the Music of AC/DC of Akadeka, where they clipped it for the sizzle reel at the beginning when this came out back in the late 90s. It wasn't the Ball Breaker tour, it was the Stiff Upper Lip tour that they were promoting. And Malcolm's like, they used to say lock up your daughters, and now when we come around they say lock up your mothers. So anyway, they go out and they're playing for like a month and doing live gigs. And then on the 23rd of February, Countdown, the TV show they've played a whole bunch of times now, films them performing It's a Long Way to the Top on a flatbed truck driven up and down Swanson Street in the heart of the Melbourne business district. The idea was a vision that Malcolm had had from the band's early days. I'm reading directly from the text right now. Although others have claimed the concept as their own, perhaps modeled after the launch of the Rolling Stones' 1975 U.S. tour where they played Brown Sugar on a flatbed truck while driving through Fifth Avenue in New York. Unsurprisingly, a planned 7 a.m. start didn't happen, but the shoot seemed simple enough, although it took some planning for producer Paul Drain. The budget for Countdown wasn't exactly enormous, and Drain had to save up to tackle special events filmed outside the normal TV studio environment. Drain says, I think we had 2 cameras from memory, and I was able to have the truck go up and down Swanson Street. Although we were only shooting one way, obviously, I think we did it in about 2 hours. And it took about 4 passes to get the shots and everything we needed. The logistics of turning the truck around, bringing the guys back, and getting the camera into slightly different positions, organizing that sort of stuff. I remember Bond going a bit crazy with the bagpipes, blowing on the bagpipes himself and having a good time. Angus says, a few times a few of us nearly came off the truck. I know that much. It was a case of, Bond would go, I'll hold the back of your shorts, and Malcolm would lean against Bond. Because it's a flatbed truck. There's nothing to stop. When it's like stop and start and you're driving and you're trying to rock out, there's no guardrails for them to there's no bed, there's no tailgate. There's no sides of that. They're going to fly right off that thing. Michael Browning says, if you see the video and look at it closely, you'll see there's not many people taking much notice of it. But in hindsight, it was a very significant event for the band, although when it happened, it was just another day in the life. It wasn't like a big, big thing. Total cost, under $400. While a second version of the video was shot in City Square, it has never been used. It simply wasn't necessary. Now let's talk about TNT, the song. I guess the title came from like a bug spray. There was like a TV commercial with a cartoon fly that flew around, which would probably be an inspiration for Fly on the Wall later, which we're going to get to in the next episode. I love the cartoon fly from the Fly on the Wall videos, and I assume that that's sort of homage to this. And Malcolm comes up with the chord progression for the song, and like Bond's kind of stuck on what to do on the chorus, and Angus in the studio is trying to sort of support him rhythmically by doing the little chant, the oi, 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 supposedly, from what I'm reading. And George Young says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And he's like, "I'm just chanting along." And he's like, "Well, hop out here in front of a microphone and do what you're doing there. Try it out." And then they liked it so much, they decided to use it for the intro of the song as well. Obviously, that became a mainstay in the band's set list for years and years and years, especially with the Brian Johnson era. That's one of those songs that does translate well, in my opinion, from the Bon Scott to the Brian era. I mean, there's not a ton of them. Bond's voice is so distinct, it's hard to kind of rework some of his stuff, and I think Brian knocks it out of the park on that one. Not that you needed my opinion on that. So anyways, they move on to, they're still recording. They play, what is it? They're playing some show, Melbourne's Meyer Music Bowl, opening for Little River Band, and they're cut off, like they shut the power off before they can play an encore, and the whole crowd just litters the stage with beer cans because they're so pissed off AC/DC doesn't get to have an encore. Beautiful. Is this painting enough of a picture for you for how disrespected AC/DC was by the establishment for so long? There's times during the era in the later 70s and early 80s and mid 80s where they don't play Australia for a long time. You know, they did so because they would be traveling around their own home country, playing venues that are getting bigger and bigger, and staying in hotels where they're not allowed to eat in the restaurant or drink in the bar of that hotel, because the management will not have anyone know that that band is actually staying there. How disgusting is that? How disgusting to be treated that way. But anyway, another great video they have is Jailbreak from this era. Also, turns out, which I didn't know this, financed by the folks at Countdown. They're filming it in a rock quarry in Sunshine in Western Melbourne. It was pretty restricted as far as the special effects budget, but they tried to figure out this whole rig with the jail doors they had built where Bond's supposed to like burst through them after an explosion blows open the doors. They didn't really know how much like explosive they were going to need to make that happen. So they actually just had a couple of guys with sticks, like pop the doors open on each side, like bang, like flip them open. So the hinges aren't really there, and the doors kind of fall over before the take gets done properly. Then they had to do some shots of Bond getting, a bullet in the back, as according to the lyrics. And I must confess right now, as a I would say lifelong AC/DC fan, and by lifelong I mean since I was 15, which is not lifelong, but I'm 43 years old, so it's most of my life. I was still late to the party. Most people that love AC/DC and can say they're lifelong fans were probably fans their whole life because their parents made them listen to it and they loved it or whatever. But I didn't. I didn't get that until 1991-ish. I try to qualify everything I say to you when it comes to opinion just because of that. If I sound terribly insecure, that's probably because maybe I am. But for the longest time, I didn't understand the lyric during the last verse of Jailbreak, where Bond says, "But he made it out with a bullet in his back." I just thought the guy escaped prison, got shot on the way out by the guards, and kept running, or eventually hid himself in the bushes and got away from the dogs and the guards or whatever. It wasn't until many, many years later that I was privy to the filmed narrative of the video where it's clear the important thing about the story is he did make it out. The fact that he died immediately after he gets out is much more poetic. It's like, how much more poetic can it get, really? That's beautiful. It's much more beautiful than I gave it credit for. I love that so much. Now, I thought I was going to end this a lot sooner, but there's so many good stories about AC/DC, and I'm not even just I'm not tearing up a lot of ground in this book that I'm really drawing the most from, Maximum Rock and Roll. You could buy this book and learn so many more things than what I'm covering. Please do. I'll put the link in the description, but I think I have to say goodbye for now. And we're going to get into some more later Bon Scott. We're going to get into more of the Maximum Overdrive filming. And then we're going to talk some more about the fly on the wall through, I don't know, Heat Seeker, blow up your video kind of era, and Maximum Overdrive soundtrack, obviously. Now, I want to say there's probably going to be a little stopgap measure coming, maybe not quite one of the shoot episodes like I've done before, last two. I've been doing so much research and enjoying so many different books and finding so many cool little stories that don't end up going in the episodes for those artists. But I don't want to lose them, and I don't want you to not hear those stories. So I think I'll do a little impromptu collection of readings for the next episode, and then jump back on AC/DC and Stephen King. And then from there, we're going to probably get back into some Chuck Berry. We're going to do some Graham Parsons and some Doors and Eddie and the Cruisers. I've been gobbling up a lot of material lately, and it's all good, and it's all exciting and fun, and I love it, and I love that you're here to listen to my interpretation of a lot of it. Now, of course, on the horizon, I've got more singles episodes. I was gathering a lot of information about Alice in Chains. I was just at a live show, tribute to Elaine Staley here in Seattle, that I got to sing on one song and play harmonica on one song with some nice fellas in the band Jar of Flies. Please check them out if you like Alice in Chains. And I'll probably get more into that stuff on the singles episode, obviously with a link to a little live in the studio thing that we did together. I was happy to be asked to do, rather. They did it. I just got to guest on one song. With all of this, I want to once again say that I'm blown away anyone's listening to this, quite frankly. And I'm glad you're here. Rock and roll is the best. And we're happy and blessed and lucky to have it as long as we've had it, for as long as we can have it. And we are lucky to have you as well, for as long as we get to have you in this world. Thank you for being here, for the people that you are with. Thank you for being a catalyst for any kind of positive change in this world. Thank you for creating anything you've ever dared to create. Thank you for trying hard to do good things in the world for anybody, especially yourself, because times like this, it's sometimes easy to forget how necessary that is.